Hello, everybody, and welcome back to A House Divided. This is Bjorn Skaptason coming to you from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. And I have our guest with us right here, and it is Dr. Karen Cox, Dr. Karen L. Cox, the author of No Common Ground, Confederate Monuments, and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice. Dr. Cox, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you. I wish it was in person, but glad to be with the Abe Lincoln Bookshop again.
Thank you very much. And we also wish you were here in person, because it's so much fun to even have a conversation like this. If it's face to face, it's just so much more fun to interact. We'll have those times again.
Sure.
We're coming to the end of this current unpleasantness, and we'll have those days again. Hey, everybody out there, we are here to talk about Karen's new book. But before we do that, I also wish to send out greetings and salutations to those of you who may be watching this conversation on C-SPAN Book TV. We are recording this event on April 12th, 2021, which is the date of release of No Common Ground. And so those of you who are watching this on C-SPAN Book TV will be watching it at some other time. But we thank you for your attention to it, and we hope that you will enjoy this conversation if you are watching it later. If you are watching it later, we will still have copies, first edition signed copies of No Common Ground available that you can order at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop's website, and that is alincolnbookshop.com. If you are watching this live on the Facebook feed, we are going to put a link to the order form in the comments so that you can go in there and order the book. Order the book. We have special signed and dated book plates that Karen was kind enough to sign for us. And thank you, Karen.
You're welcome.
That are only available if you order it on the day of the release. We have other book plates, other signed book plates that we will give you if you order it later. But if you order today, you will get a signed and dated book plate, which will create, in effect, a limited edition. Right? Here's your limited edition, Karen, of No Common Ground, signed and dated. So folks at home, feel free, get out there and order the book. That's how we can afford to put these programs on for you and introduce you to the authors on A House Divided. Now, a little bit on our guest today. Dr. Karen L. Cox is professor of history at University of North Carolina, Charlotte. She is the author of Dreaming of Dixie, Dixie's Daughter, and The Remarkable Goat Castle. And she writes about she does write in public about the Confederate Monument controversy, and she does a lot of media appearances and frequent appearances on the media about that, and has been thinking a lot about the controversy of Confederate monuments as it has recently come into popular culture. So Karen, without me answering the question for you, tell the customers, tell the audience why No Common Ground. Why did you want to write about this now?
That's a terrific question. I didn't want to write about this controversy, to be honest, initially, mainly because I'd been speaking about it since 2017. I'd been on the road a lot. And finally, it was just sort of the pressure kept building. And also noticed that the controversy wasn't going away. And one of the things that I found myself doing on a regular basis when I would talk to the media is try to explain the history of these statues. And so I was hesitant, but I finally, and I just knew I had a little conversation with myself and looked myself in the mirror and said, you're going to write this book. Mm-hmm. So I think even though I had a hesitancy in writing about it, because I knew a certain period of time about the history of the monuments that would maybe take me up to the First World War. What I didn't know was that First World War up to current events surrounding these monuments. And so, but I learned a lot while writing this book. I realized that there was so much more to the story of Confederate monuments than just the Jim Crow era story that we often hear about. And I really end up enjoying writing this. I mean, it was a little stressful at times because I was on a time schedule, but I did enjoy it, and I feel good about the book that I produced.
Oh, good, good. And for those who are thinking about buying the book, let me just chime in. I think I'm going to say this without even having to ask you a question about it, Karen, but there's a difference between a book that is a work of history and a book that is a work of activism that participates in an active way in a modern political controversy. And for any of you who are thinking of buying No Common Ground, you need to understand that this is a work of history. Dr. Cox is a professor of history, and it is the mission of the book, I can tell you, having read it, to help you understand the context in which some of the modern conflicts and controversies are happening. But the book is not going to tell you what to do with your monument in your neighborhood. That does not seem to be the goal of the book. And Karen, I don't know if you even want to chime in on that, but I want people to understand they're reading a history book, not a book that contributes to a fight.
Right. Well, it is a history book. It starts in 1865 and takes us all the way up to last summer, and last summer is still history. It's a very recent history, it's very contemporary history, but it's history nonetheless. And I thought it was, I think it's really important for people just to understand why things have been unfolding for the last 5 years, 6 years since the Charleston massacre. Why that's been unfolding, and why people should understand that what seems like only a recent phenomenon is a phenomenon that goes all the way back to the 19th century when the first monuments were being built. So it's a book that helps for people who are reading this book, to help them understand the history of these statues, understand the way people felt about them over time, and to also provide context for recent events, especially since the Charleston massacre of 2015.
Okay. And so I think that's very important when someone's thinking about picking up the book, to know that it is a history book. And as you say, last summer is history. And it takes is an historian's perspective to understand it in that context. Now, you are a historian of the South. The books you've written heretofore have been about the South. And so can you tell us what in your personal experience made you want to study the history of the South?
The simple answer is that I grew up in the South. It was all around me. Whenever I was an undergraduate history major, what I wanted to write about was what existed in the state of North Carolina. I grew up in Greensboro. My master's thesis was about female academies where planter daughters went to school, but there were actual buildings that I could go visit and see that. I was very interested in my local history, and since this time, it's my interest in this has been because these were things that were happening in the locales that wherever I've lived. I got interested in the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the late 80s, 1980s, because I was working for a museum of history. There had been a Confederate women's home there. My colleague had salvaged some lumber from that home and made benches from them. And he came to me one day and said, "Would you research this home and tell me what it's about? Because when I make these benches, I like to give a little history behind it." And that sent me down the rabbit hole that became Dixie's Daughters. So everything is really about the local. And I often feel like what we learn locally tells us a lot about what's going on regionally and nationally.
Mhm. Well, there is a saying that we probably all know that all politics is local, and it's been my experience as a student of history that all history is local.
I agree with that. I agree with that very much. And this is the thing about the whole monument issue, for people to understand, is that monuments are very much local objects. They have their own individual histories. And if people really want to know about their local monument, they can read a book like mine that provides the broader context, but then they can go to their local libraries, maybe their local newspaper, and learn more about the monument, in their community.
Mhm. All right, well, let's jump into the book. And my own personal historical preference is for the older the history, the better. So I hope I don't spend the entire time talking about 1865 through 1900, but that's my favorite period. But so first, to dive into the story of the Confederate monuments, one of the most important aspects of this book to me is its revelation of the role that women played in memorializing the Civil War in the South. So can you tell us about how white women of the South became the curators of the memory of the Confederacy?
Well, with men coming home from war, having suffered a terrible defeat in the South, women just sort of took up, um, the work of memorializing the Confederacy. They had been women during the war had been members of soldiers' aid societies, and those soldiers' aid societies manifested themselves as ladies' memorial associations after the Civil War. And initially this was a period of grieving, and so those first monuments went into cemeteries, and women were responsible for recovering bodies from battlefields like Gettysburg and returning them back to the South where they could have a proper burial in a Confederate cemetery. But it was not men at this, especially in the early decades after the Civil War, or the first decade and a half at least. It wasn't They couldn't even imagine memorializing themselves in some ways, or their fallen comrades. And so women just took this up as an extension of their role as like wives and mothers, and in their communities. And so they also, I think, as years went on and they continued in this memorialization process, they developed some leadership skills. They developed fundraising skills. They developed speaking, public speaking skills. And so it became something that they could do outside of the home, but still have the protection of, their role, that these traditional gender roles, right? That they're not trying to buck the gender system of the South. They could, but at the same time, that's exactly what they were doing in their roles as leaders of this movement. And so while it began with the Ladies Memorial Associations, it then extended, by the 1890s, to the United Daughters of the Confederacy. A new generation of women, white women in the South, joined the memorial associations in doing this. And I keep thinking, that I've often said that the UDC was an opportunity for women, Southern women, to have a career. They might not be able to go out into the workplace. That wouldn't have, especially the women of the middle and upper classes, they might not have done that, but they could have a career in the UDC, and they could apply their education and be active in their communities and do all these things I just mentioned, fundraising, speaking. They would even be lobbyists, political lobbyists, is, that's exactly what they were. Fundraisers, just amazing fundraisers. So it's a combination of the way in which the war changed women's lives and helped led them to become more public women, but with the caveat that they're in the South, and so it's very much geared toward Confederate memorialization, and at least on the surface, it's not challenging traditional gender roles.
Right. But and I'm going to share something that while we go through this conversation, I'm occasionally going to share things that we have at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. And usually when I do this, for the folks at home, I'm trying to sell it to you. Some of the things that we're going to share here in this program don't necessarily have a lot of value as in terms of money, although they're extraordinarily valuable historically. So I'm not really pitching this to you, but Karen, I'm going to give you one chance to talk about one particular UDC person, and that is Miss Rutherford. And we don't need to go all the way back to Dixie's Daughters here, but I do think that the people who are interested in Confederate monuments will want to know that there's a project going on and that there are people behind this project. One of them is Mildred Rutherford. And here we see these pamphlets that she's passing out that are pitching and teaching a privileged version of the Civil War. And when I say privileged, I mean a version of the Civil War that privileges the Confederate memory of the Civil War. It's called The Lost Cause. A lot of people who are listening to this know about the Lost Cause. But even those monuments, they have a real project behind them, and that is to tell our story.
Well, exactly. Mildred Rutherford was like a one-woman PR machine for the UDC. She wrote all these scrapbooks about various aspects of Confederate history. She wrote lesson plans that could be used in the public schools. She went on speaking tour dressed in the style of the 1850s. She was really living it up, and as this sort of representative of the Old South in some ways, and the Old South and the Confederacy. And she really felt it was important to that history could provide a defense of the Confederate cause, and so her work sort of supplements the work of those women who were really focused and primarily focused on the monuments themselves. So they're all working together. The monuments are as part of what the UDC did, the history, the education component, all of these things are working together to support what the UDC's doing. It's their agenda is far-reaching, and monuments is part of it, but so is that history. And that history is something that also gets told during these monument unveilings, for example.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And let's talk about one monument unveiling, because of course there are thousands of these monuments.
Correct.
But the first one that really gets some ink in your book is the dedication of the monument in Augusta, Georgia.
Yes.
Which is one of the early ones. And so can you fill us in, maybe just as a representative example, tell us about that Augusta monument and how that pointed the way to the ones that came after it.
I think what's really interesting about the Augusta monument is that it's really one of the earliest that comes out after Reconstruction. Once federal troops have left the region and they had left Georgia, they began, ladies' memorial associations began organizing an effort to place a monument on a main thoroughfare in Augusta, Georgia. So this was they began that in 1877 by, I think it's 1878, 79 when the unveiling takes place. So what's interesting about this is that it becomes more ceremonial, it becomes more celebratory of the Confederacy. They've moved beyond bereavement, and now they're going to be focused in on on the celebration of the Confederacy. And that's what makes the Augusta Monument a little different. And what you see in that is some of the rituals of monument unveilings that are evident right away. One of which is there would be all kinds of ceremony just for laying the cornerstone of the monument, even before the fundraising had been completed. And then a couple of years later, the monument itself would be unveiled. And then there's all this ritualization around, having parades, military style parades. Everybody's encouraged to decorate their homes with Confederate battle flags as well as the United States flag. And there are speeches being given and children are involved. And so, and it's one of the first that actually incorporates a small statue of Robert E. Lee. That kind of, what I saw is the rise of the cult of Lee, but very, very early on.
And let me follow that up with just something that, that has to stick in a lot of people's brains when they hear you say that. Did you just say that these these dedications, that these ceremonies were considered by the UDC and their people as ways to express patriotism for the United States?
Right. Well, now the Augusta Monuments is pre-UDC, but
Okay.
you're correct that at these unveilings, there was this sense that first of all, we're going to honor the Confederacy and the Confederate soldiers and Confederate military leaders, but we're also going to say, they're making the argument that they weren't really traitors of the nation. They were, very much patriots. And defenders of the Constitution, especially the 10th Amendment and defending states' rights, because that was their argument all along. And so they don't see that there's a disconnect between having loyalty to the Confederacy and loyalty to the United States.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And this does bring us up to what has to be the most, and you already talked about the cult of Robert E. Lee, but probably the first Confederate monument that a lot of people think of is the one featured on your dust jacket. And that is the Robert E. Lee Monument on Monument Avenue in Richmond. And if you'll bear with me for a second, in order to make the point that these monuments don't just spring up out of the ground, people put them there and they mean something to people. And the people that put them there tell us what they're thinking. So if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to take a minute to read a little bit of Archer Anderson's dedicatory speech about Robert E. Lee and what he's telling us that Lee and that monument represents on May 29th, 1890. And Anderson says, in his conclusion to a speech that must have been about 90 minutes long, let this monument then teach to generations yet unborn these lessons of his life. Let it stand not as a record of civil strife, but as a perpetual protest against whatever is low and sordid in our public and private objects. Let it stand as a memorial to personal honor and never brook disdain, of knightly valor without thought of self, of far-reaching military genius unsoiled by ambition, of heroic constancy from which no cloud of misfortune could ever hide the path of duty. Let it stand for reproof and censure if our people shall ever sink below the standards of their fathers. So without having, I know that may be the first time you're thinking about that, but overall, what is Archer Anderson telling us that we're supposed to think about that?
Well, he and many other speakers of the day in these unveiling speeches, first of all, they want you to connect that history, and they want the children to learn that history, which is one of the first parts of that quote, that this is somehow, this memorial is there to teach lessons. And then there's also an element of what you said. You read a long piece. I want to just do my best here. I think, one of the things about the Lee Monument, I think that particularly this one in Richmond, because there's several monuments to Robert E. Lee, but the one in Richmond on Monument Avenue is really it's about reestablishing Southern masculinity in a lot of ways. And Lee represents that for them. It's like his masculinity for them is untarnished. And somehow that monument doesn't just represent Lee, but it represents all Southern men and Confederate soldiers. And to basically hold their head high and not, not to be thinking about defeat, but to be thinking about their own heroism. And I think this is the thing that many of these Confederate soldiers or former, these veterans who spoke at these unveilings were trying to do. They're trying to reclaim their masculinity in this, several decades removed, well, at least a few, from defeat. And it becomes this like a little historical amnesia, bound up in this monument that is just is asking people to move on, but to think about it in a way that's reflecting on that as a moment of heroism, as a moment that this had been a just cause, and reclaiming masculinity in spite of defeat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And again, they're determined even then to declare that they were right.
Exactly. There is never this confession of guilt in any way, or that they were wrong. It's always the lost cause is the just cause.
Mm-hmm.
And that for many of them, they believed that it was also a sacred cause and that God was on their side. Mm-hmm. They even, turn it into that as well. And so if God is on their side, and there's no way that this could have been wrong.
Yeah. Now, then one of the next thing I want to get onto here, and it's the second chapter of your book, but I do want to tell anybody that's thinking about getting this book that while this book does a lot of great stuff, if it only did one thing, it was one of the things that you do in chapter 2, which is demonstrate that there was never a time when everybody accepted these stories about these monuments. And so there is, for the purpose of this conversation about the Lee Monument, can you take just a few minutes to introduce us to a man named John Mitchell, and an editor of a newspaper in Richmond there, and tell us why we need to be listening to John Mitchell's opinions that he stated at that time.
Right. I wish I was reading from that exact, just to use his own words. But John Mitchell was the editor of the African-American newspaper called the Richmond Planet. And he was very much a critic of what he saw that was going on. On the one hand, he said, well, we understand that people want to memorialize their leaders, but on the other hand, they're taking it a bit too far. And he was also concerned, and he was raising a red flag here, that what he saw going on at the same time that this monument was being unveiled was that he very much understood that there was a move away from the progress that was brought by Reconstruction, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but especially the 15th Amendment, which was the right for African-American men to vote, that provided for that. And he was really concerned, and he was right. There was a movement afoot to disfranchise Black men, and he saw it coming. And as part of that, his response to the Lee unveiling, he printed the words to the 15th Amendment in the paper. And he also printed responses from other Black newspaper editors around the region of what they saw happening there. And they were horrified because they looked at that and what was happening there in Richmond, and said, these men were traitors to the nation. They fought against the United States. They took up arms against the U.S. And so how is it that these men can be celebrated, not only for taking up arms against the United States, but also for fighting a war that would have perpetuated slavery? Mm-hmm. So they recognized what was happening at in Richmond in 1890.
Right. And one of the things that you see happening in this throughout this book is it helps us understand that the monuments are not static. They don't just sit there, and they weren't put, first of all, as we're talking about now, they weren't put up by people who just walked away, but also it it it's very tempting right now when we're in the middle of a controversy about it to think that, well, they've always been there and therefore they've always been accepted. And this book tells us no, they were not. There's never been a day when these monuments did not have somebody throwing up their hand and saying, wait a minute, I have an opinion about this too.
Exactly.
Now, by 1928, certainly Lost Cause Memory had done a lot to infiltrate or dominate what people thought about the Civil War, and the monuments were an important part of that. I'm going to share just briefly something because I think it's a hoot. But here's a number of men, Giles Cook and Tyler Lyon, and a number of very important white Southern men in 1928 trying to tell the state of Virginia that they must repeal a resolution of respect to Abraham Lincoln, whom they call a barbarian. And Lyon Tyler is not a shouting, red-faced, ignorant, kind of man. He's one of the most important intellectual thinkers of the 20s in the South. So it seems to me that part of the creation of these monuments in that time now, so I guess we're talking about the teens, the 20s, and the 30s, it's totally away from memorialization now, and it really is a fight for a victory for white supremacy in that time. I don't know if you feel the same way about Tyler Lyon and all that, and I know he's not part of your book, but do you see that happening at that time?
Well, in many ways, the Confederate monuments that were placed on the Southern landscape during this period, they were being placed on the grounds of local courthouses and state capitals. This is where, justice is supposed to be served, where laws are made, and the kinds of laws that are being made are legalizing segregation. There's lynchings take place on the lawns of courthouses across the South, adjacent to these Confederate monuments. Confederate monuments are absolutely representative of a culture of white supremacy across the South. And so, while women are behind the movement to place them on these courthouse lawns, they're being supported. They are supporting the legal machinations of white supremacy that are taking place. And so, yes, they're all together. And I think it's really important that we point out that that white women of the South, are just as violent in their thinking about race as the men in their lives. They wouldn't blink. They may not be there, or they might be there at a lynching on the courthouse lawn, but they certainly endorsed these things. And so the way I feel about Confederate monuments is, Confederate monuments provide the cultural underpinning of this system of white supremacy that's being legalized across the South at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And do you see that as a change from if you want to call it the original purpose of monuments, or is it more like an evolution to the next thing that makes sense?
Well, I think what's going on is that, beginning in the 1890s, see, you have to think about the backdrop for these Confederate monuments. The backdrop in the 1890s is, an increase in racial violence, an epidemic of lynching, and the Confederacy is trying to establish a disfranchising of Black male voters. All of those are, in this one decade, and then it continues on into the 20th century. So you might need to repeat that last part of your question.
Yeah,
But this is the backdrop. I mean, and so
kind of wondering
it's
if
hard to
this is part of
separate the monuments out from what has actually taken place in this same period.
Okay. Mhm. Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The monuments, these monuments, like I guess any monuments, are a conversation. They're an
Right, and they're
exercise in
being
conversation.
used by UDC members to teach children. They don't just stand there. The children, I actually interviewed women in the late 80s that were in the Children of the Confederacy when the early UDC was leading this movement, and they would tell me about not only all the portraits of their military leaders and heroes that were in the classroom, but the fact that their UDC leaders would take them down to their local Confederate monument to impart some, history around that. And this is the thing about Confederate monuments. They're never static. There are those sorts of things where the children are brought there to be taught lessons about the lost cause and the Confederacy and states' rights, and the war wasn't about slavery at all, and these sorts of things. Those things are happening. And so and then monuments are ritualized every year. Every Confederate Memorial Day, there's another ritual. There are more speeches. And so that goes on for a few generations. And what you'll see in my book is that by the time you get to the 1950s and you have a civil rights movement, the rhetoric of Confederate Memorial Day speeches becomes about communism, is anti-communist, and that's obviously a reaction to the civil rights movement.
Yes. In fact, you are anticipating where I want to go with this right now, because those monuments are already up by the 1950s. By 1955, when Emmett Till is murdered in Mississippi, and so yeah, if you can continue to sort of explore this idea of how did the civil rights movement change the conversation about the monuments, between those who are in power in white supremacist South and those who are having that power beat upon them.
Right. Well, I think what you see, what I've discovered is that during the civil rights movement, you would have, first of all, there was a lot of, the civil rights leaders are very upset about Confederate iconography in general. And it's very often it's the battle flag, because the battle flag is used by segregationists as a tool of intimidation. And those things are mobile, whereas Confederate monuments are stationary. But that complaint about Confederate memory and the ways in which white children are still being taught these ideas of the lost cause are being talked about by civil rights leaders. And you see that really pick up around the Civil War centennial, 1961 to 65, which also happens to be the most heated period of the civil rights movement, the most, when it's most intense. So one of the things I write about and what changes that is the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it's then that you begin to see Black voters are going to elect people to office who are going to better represent them around the issue of Confederate iconography. And I'm very, in one of these cases, I talk about the Meredith March and the ways in which the Meredith March, which was about registering voters, it was what he called the March Against Fear, which was to walk, it was a march from Memphis to Jackson, Mississippi. and they would go into communities, and the purpose was to register voters. And it's there that they begin to, they coalesce around Confederate monuments, because those statues are in the town square in the center of town, or they're on courthouse lawns, which is also where people might need to go register to vote, at the courthouse.
Right.
And so it is a confrontation with Confederate monuments, and it's a reclamation of the space that Confederate monuments sit on and have dominated for so long, until, and so once you see that happening, and then by the 1970s, you'll begin to see individuals who are civil rights veterans, who are being elected to their local city councils for the first time, and they begin to challenge what, they're representatives of government now, and they're going to challenge these monuments on the courthouse lawn.
Yeah, and one of them, this takes us to a great topic, is one of the people that you talk about is Harvey Gantt from there in Charlottesville.
Well, in Charlotte.
In Charlotte, North Carolina.
No, Charlottesville. It'd be easy to get that, to mention that.
Yeah, Harvey Gantt,
for obvious
and
reasons.
the things that he did in the city where you live.
Right. So Harvey Gantt, for people who may not remember, he was the first Black student to integrate Clemson University, and he moved to Charlotte in the 70s. He was elected to the city council in the mid 70s, and in 1977, 112 years after the Civil War, there was a local guy and a group that wanted to put a Confederate monument on the grounds of City Hall in Charlotte. And as you know, most of the times these things would have gone up without question. And even though the monument actually did end up on the grounds of City Hall, Harvey Gantt, as one of the earliest members of the city council in the years after the Voting Rights Act passed, calls this into question. And he has such a grasp of history and what that history meant to him. He had grown up in Charleston, South Carolina. He was surrounded by the Confederacy in Charleston, South Carolina. And the history that he learned was that in the Black public schools in Charleston, and that he had grown up with, was a history that was actually more factual than a lost cause. And he felt it was very important that he speak up as a representative of the Black community and say, these monuments, if the Confederacy had won, our ancestors would have been continued to be enslaved. And he didn't feel like that a Confederate monument being placed on the grounds of City Hall in 1977 was truly representative of a new South. In Charlotte, which of course claims the mantle of a new South city, he's saying this is not the way you do it.
Mm-hmm. So he I think is one of the more, Harvey Gantt is one of the more interesting characters, if you want to think in terms of characters, that you introduce in this book. And part of the reason is he reminds any of us that think that these things are non-controversial or have previously been non-controversial. They always were. There was always somebody to speak out against them if people were willing to listen to that.
Right. And I should mention too that he became Charlotte's first Black mayor.
Okay.
And he ran a very strong campaign against Jesse Helms for U.S. Senate in 1990. He didn't win that, but I think the fact that he was so successful scared some people.
Right. Right. Making, for the purposes of our conversation, making his voice an important voice in the debate. Now, I'm looking at my next question here, and you've kind of already answered it. But the time of the Civil War centennial had all sorts of controversies and problems involving that. And you don't necessarily dive into all of that, except to say that these Confederate monuments played a big role in some of the problems of the messaging of the Civil War centennial. But did you see more of a pushback from the people that want to put up more monuments and want to sort of defend this privileged Confederate access to common ground at the time of the centennial and after that, or did things change?
Pushback against placing these things? Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think during the period of the Civil War centennial, again, the most intense period of the Civil Rights Movement,
Mhm.
their focus is like, yes, they notice these things are there, but they're very much focused on getting the Civil Rights Act passed and the Voting Rights Act passed. And so, and you know, the Civil War centennial, at least in the South, was basically a lost cause centennial in the ways in which it was commemorated. And so you saw new monuments go up, not an explosion of monuments. There were probably 20 new monuments in the 1950s and then another 20 in the 1960s. But they might spend a lot of money on them, you know, $150,000 by the state of Alabama for a new monument at Vicksburg, in that Vicksburg Military Park. So, you know, so there's not so much pushback at that point. And there's a lot of pushback on Confederate iconography, primarily the flag, but it's really that post-civil rights, post-centennial too, where you begin to get the push and pull that starts to take place throughout the region.
Okay. And to some extent, you're also starting to tell us about, gosh, here we start talking about the phrase common ground. But we're talking really about courthouse squares. That's a lot of what we're talking about here. Town squares, the town common, or common ground. But there are also these monuments in other places that are common space. And not all of them are common, are the town square. Are these Confederate monuments also being, you know, brought into the controversies and the debates in the post-civil rights?
Well, we think about, you know, I think what you might be referring to maybe is those on battlefields, national park sites. Those are, for some people, those are controversial, but I think, you know, that with the National Park Service, that you at least have historians there who can contextualize the monuments that are there. You have every decade since the Civil War, there have been new Confederate monuments built.
Okay.
And even up into the last decade. And so, which is interesting all by itself. But what you're seeing is, again, these things that, yes, they exist in other places. They might exist in a local park, like the Nathan Bedford Forrest Monument existed in Memphis at one point. Yes. You know, that, you know, there was, and so those are also should be common ground, you know, with City Park. You know, when I was in, you know, and even along Monument Avenue in Richmond before anything was removed, was supposed to be a public space, right? It's meant to be shared space, but it's not really. You know, I was visiting a friend last November, and she said, you know, Black folk never felt comfortable in those spaces, and she's African American. She said we just didn't feel comfortable in these spaces. And so it's not common ground. It's not shared. You know, it isn't shared. And some people are okay with that, right? There will be people that say, that's fine. We don't need you anyway, right? But not on a cityscape, not in a city, not in these cities that are, that, say that they are, are talking about being models of diversity, for example. those sorts of things. And they're not really looking at the ways in which their city might be marked by Confederate memorials, by Confederate street names, and the like. And so I think that some cities, like even the one I live in Charlotte, have been reckoning with that. What do we do? What do we do with this Confederate memorial landscape?
Right. And I'm not going to ask you to answer that question.
No, that's okay.
It's not what the book does. I told people it's a history book.
Yeah.
But we just have a few minutes left, but I do want to, take it in order for us to talk about the most recent history, because that may be the reason why they pulled you back in to make you write this
It
book.
is the reason.
Yeah.
It is the reason.
So let's talk. Give us some perspective on how this controversy changed again. Maybe starting with the massacre in Charleston.
Well, this is the thing, right? It's been what we see is this pattern since then. There's always been racial violence around these monuments. I don't want to ignore that longer history, but in the most recent history, there's been terrible tragedy, racial violence in Charleston, in a massacre, and then you see the Dylan Roof with the Confederate flag, laying across his shoulder. That made people basically what has happened is that what had been a regional conversation and controversy became a national one.
Okay.
With Charleston. It was exacerbated by what happened in Charlottesville. And once again, a terrible tragedy. People were killed. There was violence there in Charlottesville. And then last summer, we have a policeman kill George Floyd, and he's currently on trial for. But in the South, the reaction to what they saw in Minneapolis was to turn on the Confederate monuments, because Confederate monuments represent to them, to more of a plurality of Southerners, not just African Americans, systemic racism and white supremacy and police brutality that's born out of those two things. And so, there's and now we're seeing these statues are just mired in the politics of divisiveness that exists and has existed and has been building for the last several years. And it's become a national issue, not just a regional, but a national issue. And that's probably why, we are having, why I wrote the book, why we are still having this conversation. And lastly, I would just say that, what the ways in which the South has responded, that is white legislatures and the GOP that dominate Southern legislatures throughout the region, their response to all of this is to pass monument laws, or something they call Heritage Protection Acts, which means that they are doubling down on preserving these statues. And what that does is create a situation such that they've taken away local control. So a community that might want to remove a monument can't do it because of state laws. And so rather than protect the monuments, they've basically invited vandalism of these monuments, because they can't get them moved. So they're out of frustration. People will, turn on them and vandalize them. And if nothing, they did last summer.
Yeah, like last summer. And if nothing else, this demonstrates something that maybe it certainly has challenged my thinking in my head, is that monuments aren't permanent. They come down all the time. In fact, it's pretty easy to pull down a lot of them. And certainly a lot of communities seem to be now having to reckon with the fact that something that they thought was permanent was never going anywhere, whether you're talking about the physical monument or the attitude of their voters. It did change, and it changed quickly. and it changed violently. I want to use that. I want to use that term carefully. Because there is physical violence against people, but also violently in that down came the monument. It was not permanent at all.
No, they aren't permanent. They don't have to be permanent. They aren't really reflective of communities in the 21st century. They're really, these statues are a reflection of the Jim Crow era in the white supremacy that in which they were built. And so, you know, there are people, I think there are, while this is a divisive issue, my experience is in speaking to community organizations and including churches. I'm having, like, some of my audience are really are churches. They're people that are religious people who are thinking. Their mind is still open to understanding and learning the history and figuring this out for themselves. It's not my goal to tell them what to do. My goal is to give them the information and let them grapple with that, because people need to grapple with it.
Right. And in a book that most definitely does not pretend to give prescriptions to what someone is supposed to do, it does share. And here we were looking at your dust jacket. And this is the last thing I think I want you to talk about as far as a topic is concerned, is that something really strange and unforeseen happened last summer on Monument Avenue. And I certainly didn't see what we're looking at there being what would happen in a Confederate monument controversy. I know that my mind was either it stays or it goes.
Right.
But it wasn't until I saw this happen, and I'm so glad you chose this image as your dust jacket. There are many ways that we can wrestle with these monuments, and they're on common ground. Therefore, they are battlefields themselves as people contest what we are to do with them and think about them.
Well, I want to just point out for folks that, you know, while there was some vandalism, there was spray painting, et cetera, what the image on the cover shows an example of protest art to have people rethink these monuments in the context of our own time. But what also happened after a period of time, what happened around the grounds of the Lee Monument, people were having barbecues and pickup basketball games, and they were registering voters. And so they reclaimed the space in a very positive way.
Right.
And so this often gets overlooked because of maybe the spray painting, but it's there are ways in which people can express their disagreement with these monuments, these statues being in their communities.
Right.
This is just this one example, but a very powerful example, I think.
Right. And I agree that I think that was a very powerful example. Well, like I said, we can't talk about everything, Karen, and I know you wouldn't want to, because there's so much more in this book than just the few things that we talked about today. And but all history is local, and this book, No Common Ground, will help us to understand how the history of Confederate monuments is a ground up history. It's comes from local communities and people, just like people need to make decisions now about what they're going to do with it. They've always needed to make decisions about this common ground and about what they're going to do with Confederate monuments. And No Common Ground provides you with excellent context to understand the history of these monuments before we get into someone else making a prescription about what we're going to do with them. And thank you, Karen, for giving us that. Is there anything else you want to tell us about the book before we finish?
I'm just glad it's publication day. That's what I'm very happy about that. I think there will be some surprises in there. People are to read it. I think it's an accessible read.
Mm-hmm.
Someone tweeted that their mother said, I'm learning a lot from this book. I'm like, that's the best review I can get, is when you can hand it off to your parents or your grandparents
Yeah.
and they learn something from it.
Okay, well, now that even though you have a lot of work to do to talk about this book, let's say that the book itself is in the past, uh, what are you looking forward to doing now that you have wrestled with this particular topic?
Well, I had completed research for a completely different book that I had to set aside.
Mhm.
And that book is, hopefully I'll get to some of that this summer, and at least organizing that material, about a tragedy that took place in Natchez, Mississippi in April 1940, known as the Rhythm Club Fire. And it's still one of the deadliest fires in the history of our country, the top five. But what makes it unique is that all the victims were African American.
Mhm.
And so the story that I want to tell gets into an understanding of Jim Crow period in this city in the South, but also the connections to Chicago, because there was a band from Chicago playing that night. And there were lots of migrants from Natchez who lived in Chicago, who were directly affected by this tragedy.
Mhm.
And there's some memorialization that happens,
Sure.
both on the landscape, but also through jazz and blues songs.
Well, I'm
Um,
definitely looking forward to reading that because, yeah, I'm sitting in Chicago, so any book that tells me a little more about the Great Migration and what's happening on both ends of
yeah,
that migrant trail is very interesting to me and other people here. Um, and and you found another reason to write about Natchez, Mississippi
I
after
did.
going.
It's the little town that I fell in love with when I wrote Goat Castle, and it's a fascinating place. It's a fascinating place, and I like all these connections. As I said, it's a local story, but it has regional and national connections.
Okay, okay. Well, thank you again, Karen.
Thank
And for those at home, this has been Dr. Karen L. Cox, and her book is No Common Ground: Confederate Monuments and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice. The book is available from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, and there's a link in the comments where you can go to get it. It is $24, and we will ship it to you with a special date of publication signed bookplate, which is today, the 12th of April, 2021. Coming up next on A House Divided, we have a program for you tomorrow. So 24 hours, we're going to turn this around and do a brand new program, and that will be a program. The guest will be Edward Steers Jr., and the book is Getting Right with Lincoln: Correcting Misconceptions About Our Greatest President. So if you want to join us tomorrow at 3:30 Central Time, you'll have a chance. Ed Steers will be sitting in Karen Cox's chair there, talking about correcting misconceptions about President Abraham Lincoln. So with that, I want to thank everybody for watching this program, and I want to thank those of you who are watching this program later on C-SPAN's Book TV, and that we are going to put this video up on our YouTube channel, and you'll get a chance to see it there too. So finally, thank you again for joining us on A House Divided, and we will see you next time.